Hello and welcome to Chile Talk. I am Neil Davidson. I am, as always, with Pete Lee. And today's topic is the Chilean constitution, which might be changing in the near or not so near future.
Yes, or there might at least be a formal process to consider an alternative to it.
Because there's going to be a constitutional convention, or there's going to be a vote on whether to have a constitutional convention.
On the 25th of October 2020, as far as we know, with a couple of months to go.
That's right. And the decision to hold even that vote on whether to have a constitutional convention was itself the subject of kind of quite a lot of toing and froing, wasn't it? I remember there have been various exercises. There was a consultation exercise a couple of years ago. Yes,
it was a project of the last Michelle Bachelet government from when about, are we talking 2014?
Yeah.
It was one of the threads of her program.
Okay, that's when her government started, or when this exercise took place. So this was in the latter part of her government. Yeah, it's probably about 3 years ago.
Yes.
And then there have been sort of all sorts of neighbourhood meetings.
Yes, cabildos, we often call them.
That's right.
Which is actually the name of, well, a town meeting. And of course the cabildos were very important in Chilean independence. People in different towns getting together and deciding what to do about the independence process.
Exactly. So this was an attempt to get just such a kind of grassroots process. Because the constitution we have now is inherited from the military government.
Yes, and of course it's a big sticking point because some people see it as a mechanism that has supported unprecedented economic growth in Chile and also stability since the end of the military government in 1990. Other people see it as a blight on the Chileans, a terrible paternalistic impost upon them that's holding them back and stopping them. That's
sort of really progressing now. But this constitution does have a lot of continuity with previous ones, doesn't it? I mean,
yes.
I remember reading the beginning and sort of saying, he who sets foot upon Chilean soil is a free man, there is no slavery in Chile, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And that's just carried on directly from earlier constitutions.
Yes.
And sound has a lovely antiquated ring about it. You know?
Yes, some of the greatest hits of the Chilean constitution's past, of course, yes, the end of slavery was something of an innovation in South America at the time, so people are very proud of that part. One of the major changes in 1980 compared to the previous constitutions was the great centrality of the family's responsibility for its members. So the family is seen as the most important intermediary body between the state and the individual. In fact, a family of only one person is a one-person family rather than an individual in the eyes of the law.
So it's kind of right. So we don't want rampant individualism here in Chile, is what it's saying.
No.
Right. If you happen to be a rampant individual, then kindly redefine yourself as something else.
Yes, and this is a aspect, I guess, of the extraordinary interest and facility that one of the main writers of the Constitution, Jaime Guzman, who was assassinated in 1991, had for Catholic corporatist thinking, and scholastic argument as well. He saw the family as a stabilizing force in society. He himself came from a broken home. His father was not with his mother, and he idealized the family as the natural Christian unit of society.
That's it. And in general, he did think in terms of kind of groupings of different types rather than individuals. So we've mentioned him before. He often comes up, doesn't he? He was the great ideologue of the military government in its early phase when it was looking for a doctrine, and he provided this corporatist, syndicalist doctrine before the dictatorship went all free market under the influence of the Chicago School.
It wasn't a one-man job, though. I mean, there was a broad participation from within the political class.
This in the last constitution. Okay, so it wasn't just the dictatorship then imposing its own.
Well,
view.
not exactly. I mean, they had a commission that included former presidents such as the radical President González Videla, the conservative, old-style conservative Jorge Alessandro Rodriguez participated. I think he withdrew himself in the end, but it wasn't simply the dictatorship formulating this. There was a really lively discussion about it.
Which is kind of odd, because this was in 1980, right? And not in the kind of more relaxed latter part of the dictatorship, but slap bang in the middle.
Yes.
When political activity was not really permitted at all.
Yes.
And yet they allowed a quite pluralistic process, relatively.
Well, relatively, obviously, anyone too far to the left was excluded, but...
Okay. So this was a document they wanted to last. They wanted it to actually have some approval.
Yes, they wanted to solve, not least because the previous constitution of 1925 had been subject to a lot of weaknesses and revision almost immediately. There was a military government that followed in 1927, the military government of Carlos Ibáñez, and basically Chile entered what retrospectively or later in the period was called the presidential phase of Chilean history, where there was a strong presidential figure ruling with a constitution that was not particularly watertight.
Right.
And obviously the armed forces enforcing the constitution was basically the way that it worked.
Yeah.
Of course, until the military coup. There'd been plenty of military coups before that, but the lasting one of Pinochet in 1973, after basically various conservative forces ruling that Allende was unconstitutional in his behaviour.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it's interesting because the Constitution of 1980 has a personality as this evil vestige or continuation of the military government, which is fair enough.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is if it is to be removed, what is it going to be replaced with? And this is what terrifies a lot of people.
Yeah, I'd have thought, it seems at the moment fairly easy to imagine. It would be some like brick of a document filled with, fine-sounding phrases about equality of rights and gender rights and all the fashionable things of the moment. I would imagine.
Yes, they could certainly be underlined. There's talk of formulating the Constitution with parity of gender in representation, which will be the first time in the world that that's been done.
Yeah.
But there aren't many instances in the world where people somehow claiming to represent the people without claiming to be politicians have written a constitution. And in Chile we have this very strong distinction between the idea of professional politicians and somehow people who can represent the people without claiming to be professional politicians.
Well, you've spoken about this before, like there's the social, which pretends to be not political. And so this would fall into, and makes it all nice. So this would fall into one of these. So because the idea is that people who participate in this convention would not be allowed actually to be practicing politicians.
Yes.
For how long afterwards? Some years.
Oh yes, there's some stipulation. I think it's all being negotiated at this stage.
Right. So there's nothing fixed at all. So this is rather odd, isn't it? And well, this thing about gender parity, again, it just smacks of implementing the ideas that happen to be fashionable in this particular month of 2020,
It could be a good one. If only for removing the also fashionable critique of Chilean law as too patriarchal. So in Chilean history, people can often look at Chilean history and you look at the public side of Chilean life, it is very patriarchal.
Right.
But the private side of Chilean life was always very matriarchal.
That's right. Chile is often described as a nation of huachos, fatherless children, essentially.
Yes, foundlings or...
huacho means, I suppose, a bastard, really, but it means, in this case, fatherless children.
Yes.
Brought up by their mothers, because the fathers were too feckless. to do so, are too drunken, is the traditional idea. And so Chile is considered to be this country of strong women who bring up children, who work, and there's definitely a grain of truth in this, So certainly the strong figures in private life are not necessarily men by any means.
No. So certainly having gender parity in the formulation of the Constitution removes that complaint. And there are lots of complaints that can be removed.
Okay, so what is wrong with the present Constitution, actually? Let's just try and nail it down.
I think that there are two things wrong with the present Constitution. One of them is that symbolically it's untenable because it is associated with a military government that's been subject to a kind of history that focuses on emotional reconciliation. There's been a very professionalized memorialization industry that's been imported from Argentina. It was imported from Holocaust memorialization to Argentina. Then Ernesto Sabato wrote his very famous report in 1985. Never Again, it was called in Spanish, which of course is a famous Holocaust phrase. So Chile adopted that from 1990. Of course, it had become highly elaborated at that point in not only in Argentina, but also in academic circles.
Got it.
And as such, any direct symbol of the military government is anathema. So that's a big problem. Now, another problem is we're not sure how instrumental the Constitution that we have has been in the enormous improvement in quality of life and the economy in Chile since 1990 at least, or since the end of the 1980s in fact.
Should one think it has had such one doesn't normally expect, constitutions can create a stable society, but they can help. They don't bring economic growth, do they?
Well, protecting individual enterprise is quite an innovative feature of the Chilean constitution.
Okay.
There's subsidies for, behaviours that are deemed to be good, and there's a small amount of charity that in other places in English-speaking countries would be covered by a welfare state function.
Yeah.
And then there's enormous freedom for enterprise, which many people have taken up.
Yeah.
Chileans are now quite an enterprising people, I think, in many respects. So we don't know how important it's been, and we don't know what changing certain settings would have to do with Chilean enterprise. We don't know where the funding for any new state functions that might come about as a result of a new constitution would come from.
Yes, there is clearly scope for raising. Chile's a low tax country.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's been very attractive to investors. It's delivered a certain degree of financial stability to the country.
Yeah.
Now we're in dark times. The country's been locked in crisis. We're not quite sure how that all arose. So perhaps it's easier to do away with this symbol now and try and replace it with something better.
Maybe. So, but I think there are one or two more specific points that people object to. One is the funding for the armed forces that's enshrined in the Constitution, right?
Yes.
Which is a portion of the copper revenues.
Yes.
Which can be very large.
Yes.
And the result is that the Chilean Air Force has, pretty modern fighter, squadrons of very modern fighter jets, for example, on the northern border with Peru, facing essentially training aircraft. A complete overkill in terms of relative military capacity.
And at the same time, no military capacity in the sense of intercontinental ballistic missiles or a nuclear program or any of the really big ticket items.
Right, just lots of lovely fighter aircraft. And there hasn't been a war for 140 years.
Not with anyone else.
Right.
There was a big war, a big civil war.
Right. Traditionally, Latin American armies are used against their own people.
Yes.
And
it's had some deterrent value. Even in the late 70s, apparently the US ambassador to Argentina when Argentina was considering a stoush with Chile over basically the islands at the south of Chile and Argentina. The US ambassador simply told the Minister of War of the military government of Argentina at the time, you can fight that war, but the Chilean Navy is better than your Navy. And in that particular kind of conflict,
that would be decisive.
I will have to give you a military lesson. Yes.
Right.
So there is this deterrent value of the capacity. It's a big source of nostalgia as well, that Chile has been militaristically successful, and there's some desire to recover pride in that. Oscar Landereche, he's trying to convert himself into a presidential candidate. He's a declared presidential candidate from the Socialist Party. He writes a rather lovely account of when he was with his parents as a child in Gloucester in England, and there was a fancy dress day at the school, and the school was full of people from the military barracks. There's a very large military barracks in Gloucester, and many British military families lived there. So his father, who was an academic, decided, and his mother, also an academic of sorts, decided that he would be dressed as an artilleryman of the War of the Pacific. So they made him a uniform in full military dictatorship in Chile at the time, and sent him along to fancy dress day, which I think is a wonderful gesture, because terrible though the War of the Pacific and the other wars that Chile's fought with itself and with its neighbours, it is part of the mythos of the country. Going back to obviously the famed defence by the Mapuche people against Spanish colonialism.
Right.
It's a great source of sort of solidaritarian pride.
Yes. Yes, that's
It's a bit macho is the problem with the militarism.
Sure.
As a rule. So it's very difficult to see exactly what is going to come out of any attempt to formulate a new constitution. The constitution before the Constitution of 1925 was the Constitution of 1833, and this was formulated by the Pelucons, the conservative faction of the ruling class at the time, Mariano Egaña and Diego Portales, and it was considered to be a very, very strong, very conservative document. It worked with the church rather than against the church, so the church fulfilled functions such as births, deaths and marriages up until the 1870s, when there was a reform called the lay laws. Those functions and other functions, including in education, passed to the state. And that constitution was widely admired in Latin America and even outside Latin America, as opposed to the racier constitution that was eventually formulated in Argentina in 1853, I guess, mostly written by Juan Bautista Alberti, in Valparaiso. In fact, he was actually exiled in Valparaiso.
Okay, I'm just listening. I'm just listening. This is taking me into deep water here. I'm out of my depth.
And he looked at all the constitutions. His favourite constitution was the Constitution of California, which had, for a short time, a constitution as a republic after freeing itself from Mexico, and then had a state constitution that enshrined education very centrally. So he got a lot of good ideas from there. Argentina's kept the same constitution but changed it so many times that it's been kicked out.
So it's like the knife that's had two new blades and one new handle kind of thing.
Yes. Whereas the Chilean way has been more to take the greatest hits out of the previous material. And,
Chile has no slavery, and to get the new one.
And at particular points in time, to come up with a new constitution. So basically by the late 19th century, the constitution of 1833 was becoming a bit unwieldy, and there wasn't room for much in the way of even the light democratization that was offered at the time. So obviously Jose Manuel Balmaceda was something of a reformer, something of a populist with a very limited suffrage at the time, but he was considered to be a bit of a firebrand. And after he was removed in the Civil War of 1891, basically the constitution was not exactly suspended, but Chile entered into a period that's called rather euphemistically the Parliamentary Republic, which was not very parliamentary. It was simply the ruling class dividing things up according to its own ways.
Right.
It was highly dysfunctional, but it had the advantage of the vinegar strokes of the saltpeter revenues. It became more dysfunctional during World War One and after World War One, and had to be replaced by the Constitution of 1825, which is a bit more...
1925.
1925, exactly. A bit more of a modernising document, but that was revised backwards, revised down during a military government by...
That's right. So change is not always necessarily in the same direction.
No.
And that brings the question, so I mean, presumably, what triggered this demand for a new constitution? So the vote now on whether to hold the Constitutional Convention, I think we've already said it's going to be held in October.
Yes,
that's
the 25th. There's some talk about delaying it. There's some talk that it won't be legitimate. I actually think that this constitution, the question of the plebiscite, there's a couple of questions in the plebiscite, but the main one is, do you approve of there being a constitutional convention? Or do you reject the possibility of any constitutional convention and therefore support the constitution that we already have? And the feeling I have is that it will be viewed as illegitimate if approved doesn't win. It will be widely viewed as illegitimate simply because there's an outsized, noisy social demand around that notion.
There certainly is, and the decision to call this referendum was triggered by the protests. So I suppose it's likely enough that some of the protesters' demands will find their way into the new constitution. Otherwise, they will consider the whole thing illegitimate. And actually, what were the protesters' demands? Because I remember going around asking people at the time, and then immediately forgetting the answers.
Yes. Yes.
It's like I remember saying somebody was blocking the road, and I just ran and said, "Why are you blocking the road?" Por la causa, because of the cause. Okay, could you be a bit more specific? What exactly is the cause? What is this great thing?
Well, I mean, there's been some soundings done of public opinion, and the public opinion seems to be that approve will win. People claim that they will go and vote 70-30 for approve.
Okay. But what do they want to be in the new constitution? Let's just cut to the end game.
We don't know, because...
What do the protesters want to be in the new constitution?
Well, the follow-up question to some of these soundings, to one of these soundings that I saw, was to those who approve of constitutional convention, do you know what will be voted upon in the constitutional convention?
Right.
And only 22% of people did know. And close to 40% do not know. Another 30-something%. I sort of think they might know, but don't answer.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I feel we have to give our viewers value for money here by trying to formulate what it is that the protests were actually about. Because I felt I sort of knew at the time, then I kind of forgot. And I mean, they want everything to be better, of course, but in what way?
I think ironically enough, it has something to do with economic opportunity. It's simply about there being manifest economic opportunity. And we're not seeing economic growth at the moment. Young people in particular are stymied by that.
Of course, so people talk about inequality, they talk about a bad public health system. That's a big thing, actually. Pensions. Yeah, these things that were coming up in the cabildos, in these local meetings. A lot of people talked about pensions, very meagre pensions. Essentially, looking at it from a kind of European perspective, you think what these people want is a welfare state. But they don't seem to know that.
Yes.
They're not saying we want a welfare state, they're saying this is really bad, the pension's really bad, health system's really bad. the private health insurance is too expensive, the private pension system is expensive. But you think you want to offer, just like say it, and they kind of don't say it. But it's certainly no coincidence that we've spoken before about how the current president, Sebastián Piñera, was the first centre-right government after the dictatorship, came to power in the early 2000s, promising to bring free enterprise economic growth. There was tremendous economic growth because he got lucky, world economic boom, high copper prices. And he was re-elected promising more of the same. And he was, re-elected reasonably sort of comfortably, I think, wasn't he?
Yes. Yes.
And he didn't deliver economic growth, essentially because it was not in his power to do so. But the world economy was against him, the copper price was against him. So bad luck, but then he'd had good luck before. And that was when people started getting really upset. It was just because there was no growth.
Yes.
So actually, it does seem to come...
Yeah. It's a fairly prosaic reason, isn't it?
I guess everything was bearable until there was no growth.
Yes. Yeah, so it's very interesting what we're going to come up with.
Sorry, I'm just going to quote, there's an American economist called Jude Wanniski. I may have got the surname slightly wrong.
Wadowski? No.
It's certainly closer to Wanniski than... And he's got a great saying, which is that if you don't give people capitalism, they'll take socialism, So basically, Piñera failed to give people capitalism, strong economic growth and a free market economy, and they want socialism. It's as simple as that, probably.
Well, I think there's a parable from very early on in the constitutional history of Chile. In the 1820s, one of the constitutions that was formulated was called the Moral Constitution. And this constitution made available universally citizenly rights to people who could satisfy a number of moral criteria.
What a lovely idea. I mean, one can see the flaws and the possible...
not having
all the ways it could go wrong,
not having committed a felony and so on, keeping your house tidy, I don't know what else. And of course, the great problem of this very innovative constitution was that this moral constitution described Chile as it ought to be rather than Chile as it is. And the big problem that's facing us now is the possibility of a constitution being formulated that describes Chile as it ought to be and not as it is. So if Chile is going to go in the direction of a welfare state, it has to find the resources and the mechanisms, the clean mechanisms to deliver reasonably efficiently those undertakings of a welfare state.
Which it has the resources, as I think we've mentioned before. Chile is certainly richer per capita than the European countries were when they introduced their welfare states. But the wealth is very concentrated. So it's going to mean considerably disadvantaging a relatively perhaps not such a small number of people who are not used to paying a lot of tax.
Yes. Yes. And I'm not even sure that the Chilean public service has great confidence in its ability to spend the money of individuals better than they themselves spend it.
Right. It couldn't happen overnight. There would have to be a greatly strengthened public service. Yeah.
Yes. So it's interesting. There's a kind of sense of full circle. I mean, we might find it rather amusing, the identity politics and such that's fashionable in other parts of the world, and thanks to the speed of the internet has managed to insert itself a little precociously in the other aspects of societal development in Chile. But I think there is a possibility of this becoming another moral constitution that brings us back to...
Yeah, okay, lovely analogy. And I'm glad you brought up the moral constitution. I think it could well be that. Just that ideas of morality change with each generation, and therefore every moral constitution is different.
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much for... Sorry, did you want to add anything?
No,
we're all there.
No, I think that's the final clause.
Yeah, excellent. There we are. We will seal our document. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you next time. And do press subscribe if you